lesson is Bootstrap 3, and right. So the main thing about Bootstrap 3 is its responsive web design. So each website that's developed should respond to users' behavior, right? So if you're looking at it at a desktop, you're looking at it mobile phone, if you're looking at it portrait view, landscape, it should all change dynamically to fit the user's browser, screen size, orientation, and platform, right? So if it's in IE, Chrome, whatever browser that you're using. And the way you do this is you use flexible grids and layouts, right? So the grids will shift depending on the size of the screen and the orientation. Flexible images, so the images will resize themselves so that they fit neatly within your screen. And then CSS media queries. So how do you determine this is what determines what screen size you're actually viewing, right? So these will kick in whenever it'll know whenever you go from desktop view to smaller view. So Bootstrap 3, what it does is it uses mobile-first design. And what mobile-first design means is that you design your website for a mobile phone first, and then you expand outward. So then you go from mobile design to tablet and then to desktop design, right? So before it was, you would design it for a desktop, and then you would go back and realize that you needed it for mobile devices, and then you would actually create a whole different. Sometimes you would create a whole different site just for the mobile devices. So you'd have. Sometimes you would see www.mobile.regions.com. That's the whole site just for the mobile platform. Whereas this is trying to go and say you want one web design, you want one website that's going to fit your desktop, your tablets, and your mobile phones. So with Bootstrap 3 out of the box, what you get is you get global styles, the grid system, which what we just talked about, shift the content around to neatly fit your content in your browser. And then styles for common HTML elements, so tables, forms, buttons. You can create actual tables and they'll look nice right out of the box. Styles for common interface components, so page headers, nav bars. Nav bars pretty important in Bootstrap. With a couple of classes, you can get your nav bar up and ready with no hassle. And then you've got JavaScript plugins like modal, popovers, and tooltips. And we'll talk a little bit about the JavaScript plugins later. So browser support and device support is pretty big for Bootstrap. There's about 4 that aren't supported, but for the most part, Bootstrap 3 is supported throughout all the browsers and devices. So what do you get with the Bootstrap? You get the CSS folder, and what that has is a non-minified Bootstrap CSS file and a minified Bootstrap CSS file. And the minified version of it is just it takes away all the spaces and uline characters, and it's a smaller size file, right? And then you get the Bootstrap theme, minified and non-minified. So you don't have to use their theme. You can just use the Bootstrap components and add your own theme later on if you don't want to use the Bootstrap. And then the Bootstrap.js file, and that's really only if you're going to actually use the JavaScript plugins. If you're not planning on using any of the JavaScript plugins, I'm sorry, you do need this. If you use any of the JavaScript plugins, you will need jQuery added as well. And then the fonts. And the source code, you can also download the source code. And instead of the CSS files, you'll actually get a less file. And we'll talk about this in a little bit later. But you pretty much get everything the same. And some examples. And there's also CDN support for it, so if you don't want to download any of those files yourself, you can always have that option. So what do you need to set up Bootstrap? Really all you need is a link that points to your Bootstrap min CSS, and then a script that points to your Bootstrap min JS, and then jQuery if you're using any of the JavaScript plugins. All right. Any questions so far?
Any of the major versions of jQuery, or is it 2.1 for Bootstrap, right?
I think it has to be 2.1. I think the latest. You might be able to get away with maybe 2, but the more you go.
4.8, 164.
Yeah. Okay. So sample site. So we have in our portal we have MDC things that we like, and this is a site without Bootstrap, right? So let's take a look at that. Simple site, all HTML, no CSS, right? Let's add the Bootstrap links that we just saw. A little bit different. The styles changed a little bit here. The links changed, but not really. Not much has changed. Right? And we're using Bootstrap right now. So let's take a look at the grid system. And then as we move forward, we'll actually add more content, more bootstrapping to this site, and we'll see how we can make it look a little bit better. But the main and biggest component of Bootstrap is their grid system. And out of the box, it comes with 12 column grid. You can change this in the CSS, but this is the default. And you can also change the media queries to how they handle the different sizes. So you can so at media query 780 pixels, it'll start changing. That's the media query for, let's say, tablet mode. If you don't want that default pixel size, then you can change that as well. But you can use the grid system simply by saying div class and then having a row. So you can only specify columns within a div that has a class of row, and it has to be immediately following that class, right? And then you simply just say column small 3 and then column small 9 for, so this is one column and then this is another column. So what this is saying here is saying on small screens I want this column to be 3 columns wide and I want this column to be 9 columns wide. But when you get on a bigger screen size, let's say tablets and above, or just tablets, I want them to be equal, right? But if I get to a desktop mode, or even larger, then I want this one to be 4 columns wide, and I want this one to be 8 columns wide. So you can specify however you want it, right? If, let's say, if we only specify column medium 6, and we leave out column small 3, column small 9, column large 8, and 4. What it does is, any screen sizes above medium, so medium and above, it's going to use this, 6 and 6. So if you have a large, it's going to use 6. If you have medium, it's going to use 6. But anything below medium, it's going to start collapsing. So you're not going to have this 6 and 6. You're going to have you're going to have one column here and then one column here, right on top of each other.
They're not really columns
They're not, yeah, they're not columns anymore. But as you expand, they're gonna become columns again. Right. You can also use in this example, medium 4, they're the same size, but I want to offset the first one by 4 columns, right? So it's, in this one, you're going to have, the first column is going to appear here, and then the second one is going to be here, right there. Right. Any questions on the grid system? This is kind of a high overview of the grid system, but pretty straightforward.
How do you define what a small medium are? Or
That's already predefined in the Bootstrap CSS using media queries, right? But you can go ahead and modify those.
But if you wanted to customize it, you can go ahead and change that.
Yeah, you can customize them too. And as we'll see, there's an easier way of customizing it other than just going through your CSS and digging through all of it. There's a lot easier way of customizing this whole thing. But out of the box, this is what you get. Okay, so also you get responsive utilities. So we can say dot visible XS, and let's say there's a picture or some content that you only want to show to mobile users, right? So you'll say dot visible XS, and it will only be visible for screen sizes that are less than 768 pixels. Everything above that, as the screen grows, it'll hide it. Right. And you kind of want to be smart on how you use this, right? So if you want to hide something, if you only want to show something in a small screen, you don't want to say, hide medium, hide large, and then hide small, because that will be the same thing, right? If you do dot hidden SM, dot hidden MV, dot hidden LG, is the same thing as if you have saying dot visible dash XS, right? So you kind of want to be smart on how you use your classes there. All right. So this is with the MDC site with the nav bars and themes. So let's see if we can get it to look like that. So this is just with the grid system and the container. And we haven't really talked about the container, but let's talk about that. Simply by adding this class container right here, the site went from all the content being on the left-hand side right here to being nicely fitting within your browser, right? And what that does is yeah, so right, so this is the before. This is just with the Bootstrap links. We haven't added any of the classes. And this is gonna make all my content go all the way to the left, right? It's not really centered, and it's not really responsive. So here, the first thing I did was come to the header and add this class container, and then for each, and then for this section, I added class container. just by doing that, shifted all my content right in the middle. And as I resize, it adapts and it keeps that padding on both sides. Right? So as I keep going smaller and smaller, it'll just resize with me. The next thing is using the grid system. This is just a feature divider. It just adds a little horizontal line. What I'm doing here is I have an article, right? So let's say for lunch, I have the Pita Pit food, and then I have the Firehouse, and then I have Ollie's. Each one of them are articles within the lunch section. So before, they were just like this. So the image was on top, and then the description was right at the bottom. So simply by saying column medium 5 and then column medium 7, that shifted it to looking like this. Right? So this is taking 5, and then this is taking 7. And just going down through and doing it for all of them.
As if the columns are within that article, and
Yeah.
not directly within the word, so it's still
Yeah. Alright. So now let's add navbar to the site. So launch it. Now we have our links kind of like looking like this, and the only thing that we had to do to make them look like this was all I did was add nav and then navbar nav and then saying that it's going to go all the way to the right. Simply by doing that, it adds the styles right here. But if you can see, if we do this, let's resize it. Actually, I don't know why I'm doing that. Alright. So you see, if we have on a small tablet how the links came down as opposed to right here, or if we go to mobile, it's kind of looking like that. So we want to fix that. We want to have this to hide. So whenever the user goes to a mobile device, instead of the links showing up like this, we kind of wanted them to collapse and hide, right? And allow them the option of a drop down and selecting the nav bar. So let's take so I'm going to specify this entire div that holds my logo and my links here, and I'm going to say navbar default. So I'm going to say this whole thing, this whole div is a navbar, and I want you to style it as a default navbar. And then specifying this says that I always want my navbar to stay on the top. So whenever I scroll down, it's going to stay fixed, and I'm always going to be able to see that navbar. Then I'm going to say here that this is my navbar header. So let's see how that looks with that. Okay. All right, so we're getting a little bit closer to what we want to see. And so what I'm specifying here is that since these are my links, I'm going to say navbar collapse. And what that does is it's going to know when the screen reduces its screen size, and it's going to collapse all these links for me. Right. So let's see what it does. See how they were all showing up here, but the minute the screen size reduced, they all collapsed. But the problem is, now you can't access them, right? So we need to fix that. The way you do that is you can add a button. And what the button's going to do is going to toggle the collapsed. So remember, before we added the collapse and we resized the screen, all the links just went below the logo, right? Well, that's kind of what we want whenever the user wants to see the links, right? And now we have it where they're collapsing, right? So we kind of want to switch between those two modes. And what's going to let us do that is adding a button with, and this just says that this button is of type class button, and it's just going to style it using the Bootstrap styles. But also saying that it's going to be used for the navbar toggle, right? And the important thing here is the data toggle. So what is it toggling? The collapse, which maps to here. So it knows that it's going to toggle this div right there. And the data target is the class that we specified here. So it knows that its functionality is to toggle. And what it toggles is the navbar collapse. And then here we're just adding a span. And this comes with Bootstrap. It's a glyphicon, and it's just chevron down, which is just going to be a downward pointing arrow. Yeah.
So you're tying to the classes right to the data
Yeah.
if I have
Multiple. That typically you would only, for good practice, you would only want to have one navbar. If you have something else that's below, it's not going to really be a navbar. It might be a list or something, because you're not actually going to be navigating from page to page, right, with that one. But if you do, you can always just say collapse, and then as long as the class is different, because I can say ID navbar, and then instead of this, I can just say, pound navbar. It'll be the same thing. But I would recommend not having multiple navbars, only because it would be,
Yeah, my question was like, so these types of classes,
yeah, like, since we're specifying the dot, it's just going to look for the class. So if it's just going to look for an ID. So this wouldn't work because there is no ID named navbar collapse. Yeah. All right. So we have our links there. And then as we get smaller, there's our button with the glyphicon, and as we click it, it'll drop down for our navbar, right? So you can click on that. And we've done this all really with just adding classes, right, to our HTML. We haven't really touched any CSS or any JavaScript or anything like that. And it's responsive, right? So looking at a mobile phone to looking at a desktop, same experience. Any questions on this? I'm going pretty fast. We're not halfway through, but
Does it change to the chevron when you get to that medium specification or small?
to switch over to as you can see, like, okay, right now you don't see a button, but you only see it as the screen size reduces, right? So the button always looks like this.
isn't that list, sort of the overlap, the title? Is that the trigger that causes the button pop? Maybe?
The button pop, what gets triggered is the media queries from Bootstrap.
Okay.
So the same thing that triggered these links to show up underneath the logo is the same thing that triggers the button to show up
No, I
as
think
well.
what the question is, on the grid system, you're specifying the different widths, different media queries that can be applied to different methods. So what is it which medium, extra small, small, large, at which point is it decided to switch to the icon instead of the
Oh, this is not attached to the grid.
So what is it attached to? Is it just a
It's-
default CSS?
It's the default media query that Bootstrap uses to determine when you're in mobile view or tablet view. Because even in the grid, I'm not specifying, I'm just specifying, I'm telling Bootstrap, whenever you're in medium-sized screens, then I want you to lay out just the way it is. But Bootstrap itself determines when it's in medium-sized screens. So
So then I guess, what if you want that chevron to only show up when you're on small size screen, everything else will always get the width? Is that possible?
I think you would be able to just add the class and then just do dot visible the same way that we did. But I'm not sure on that. I think you either do it this way or you would have to specify the actual pixel sizes in the media queries that in the CSS.
So is the appearance of the button controlled by that first class and what? Is it needs to be an or power, how much is it?
Yeah. I mean, you can add classes throughout. I mean, there's no limitation, right? Yeah, but that was a good question. I'll check on that. If you guys can actually do the dot visible. But typically, Bootstrap would be a better judgment of when the the button should show, unless you're coding for maybe a particular device that you know that only that device is going to be being used. But yeah. Any other questions? So now we have it looking like that. Okay, jQuery plugins. We're going to look at a jQuery plugin in a few minutes, but there are a couple of jQuery plugins that come with Bootstrap, and you have the option of importing them all into one JS file or importing them individually for each JS. So if you're doing like a modal, you can import just the modal JS instead of importing the entire suite. You can do it exclusively through the markup, so just the way we're doing with the classes, you can add the jQuery plugins just using classes, or you can do it from the JavaScript API. And there's custom events as well. So if like you're using modal, when it shows, there's a custom event that you can register for the show and the hide, things like that. So let's add the scroll spy plugin. Alright, and to add the scroll spy, in our body, we just have a data type, data spy, and then say scroll. And so what this is going to do is going to register the whole page as saying, I want to know when people are scrolling through this entire body. And then the data target is navbar default, which is this right here. So I want to register when the people are scrolling and link it up to this navbar default, right? And we'll see. So whenever I'm scrolling down through lunch, it's going to say, oh, you're at lunch, you're at the apartment section, you're at the auto service and repair section. And the way we do that is you have an href here. It says lunch, and then you have an ID that matches lunch here. Right? So the scroll spy is going to know whenever you start scrolling and it gets to this section of lunch, it's going to know to highlight this link here, knowing that you're now on that section. So as we scroll down, lunch is highlighted, and we get to apartment, and auto service repair. So as we scroll up, you can also click on it and it'll take you to that section as well on the page. And this is a JavaScript plugin. Like I said, you can do it all through the HTML markup, so there's no jQuery or JavaScript that you have to write. Just simply state the body that you're scrolling through, and then the IDs match each section that you want to scroll through. Any questions on the scroll spy? Yeah. Yeah. So if I don't have this ID, it's not going to work. So if I take that out, see, lunch is not working anymore. But if I get to apartment, it works. So it has to know what section starts each link. Any questions on the scroll spot? Or any JavaScript plugin in general? Alright, so like I said, you can also customize the Bootstrap. So these are all the less files and we're going to talk about less files in a little bit. But you can decide what components you want to include, right? So let's say I don't want any of the JavaScript components. This is fine. The jQuery, let's say I'm not actually going to use scrolls by, so I'll take those out. And the only thing that's doing here is you're reducing your footprint, right? So the smaller your Bootstrap files sizes are, the faster your pages are going to be loaded. And so you can modify different, gray color, so I want it something. You can specify the typography, so what font family sizes are. So any padding, you can customize all of this. Drop down media query, breakpoints. So these are the breakpoints whenever the screen size is reduced. So let's say I'm thinking XS is not really 480 and maybe it's 300. So I'll just specify that. And so that's what's going to determine when the button actually shows, right? So if I do, maybe not XS, but if I do medium, right? If I reduce this, then it's going to take longer for the button to show. So if I do 400, it's probably not the button's probably not going to show until it's 400 pixels. The grid system, you can customize the grid system. So I don't want 12 columns, but I want 15. So tabs, pagination, pretty much you can customize anything that you want here. And then at the end of it, you can compile and download, and then this is what you'll include in your Bootstrap. And this will be smaller than if you just download the out of the box Bootstrap. Any questions on customizing? All right, now we're getting to the interesting part, is the CSS preprocessors. So you add Bootstrap to your site, right? And then some of the complaints that people get is that you add Bootstrap, and I don't think it's that much of an issue now. But as we just saw, I added Bootstrap, and it didn't really dictate how my site looked as theming wise, right? It didn't say this is I am now Bootstrap. It just kind of made it more responsive. But in the past, people have complained that it's easy to use Bootstrap, but it's hard to go to unbootstrap or unbootstrap the theme. So not make your website look like Bootstrap. And typically the way you do that is either you modify the Bootstrap CSS file, or you add your own style on top of it, and then you start modifying all the buttons and the forms and everything that you want, right? That can be a hassle, simply just using CSS. I mean, CSS alone has its limitations. There's a lot of repetition, right? It's not very easy to maintain, and it's not very easy to read, right? So what they came up with is CSS preprocessors, and this is pretty much the opposite of CSS. It's less repetition than CSS. It's easier to maintain, easy to set up, and easy to learn. And we looked at less, right? And a big thing about less is all CSS is valid less. So you can have a less file and have only CSS, and it'll still behave like CSS. It'll modify your site the way you want it to look and feel. The thing about less is it's dynamic style sheet language. And it gives you more of a programming feel to CSS than just simply stating, style sheet facts like button is certain width, certain color, things like that. It compiles to CSS. Ultimately, we're talking about less, and there's Sass as well. But all preprocessor languages have to be compiled to CSS, right? Ultimately, you are going to use CSS on your website. But before you use CSS, you can use less. And the way that you do that is you use less, and then you compile to CSS. and it can be processed. Less can be processed on the client side or the server side. So all you need to do to use less is, instead of a CSS link in your HTML page, you'll have a less file reference, and then you'll have the less.js script. And what that does is the JS script will take the less, compile it to CSS, and then render the page to the user. The only problem about that is that you're doing the compiling on the client side, right? So typically you want to do it on the server side, but the option is there if you want to. And Bootstrap was built on less. So if you're so when we looked at the source code, you got the less files. You can just start opening up those less files, and all the Bootstrap logic is in there with less. So it's easier to modify Bootstrap with less if you do want to modify Bootstrap that way. And with less, what do you get is you get variables, you get operations, you get mixins. So mixins are kind of like functions that we'll talk about in a little bit, and nested rules. And we'll talk about all these. Sass is another preprocessor, and it's more powerful than less, and it has everything that less has, but it requires Ruby to use Sass. Even though Bootstrap was built with less, it has been ported to Sass, so you can use Sass with Bootstrap. And Sass and less have different syntax for their languages, so that's why it's most people that have gone away from Bootstrap and used other themings, other responsive web design components other than Bootstrap is because it doesn't use Sass. Sass is so much more powerful than less. But that's changed now. And what Sass allows for is the same thing that less has, but it also has functions, which are different than mixins, and we'll see that in a little bit. And it also has control directives like if, for, and each, so you can actually use if, for, each logic within your Sass files. Any questions? I'm going a little bit fast. So Sass variables. So let's say you have a color, and let's say your main color is yellow. Instead of saying, putting yellow throughout your CSS file, you can have a variable that just holds the value yellow. And the same thing as variables in any other languages. It's maintainability. You want to change the default color of your site, you just have to change it in one place. You don't have to change it in every other location that you're using it. And Sass rules. So what the Sass rules allow is for nested rules. So it implies cascading and specificity. So let's say you have a unordered list and you want to style that unordered list, right? But you also only want to style links within that unordered list. You can nest those rules within it. So when you're looking at it, it's a lot easier to read, right? Let's take a look at that. I'm deleting these, and we'll see why in a little bit. Right, so this is an example of nested rules. So I have my body, and I want to specify the margin top, but I also want to specify background for that body. And so this is what we talk about in nested rules. I can nest the background within body and then specify all the properties that I want. Right, so instead of saying body space background, I can just write it this way, and it's a lot more easy to read. So what you change. And I downloaded a extension here called I think Orange Bits, and what it does is when you save your file, okay, so when you save your file, it'll automatically compile your Sass into CSS. So we have body, and then what it did, the background color. Yeah. Okay, so we also have Sass directives. So you can import Sass files into another Sass file. And typically when you're doing with CSS, if you import a CSS file within another CSS file, it doesn't actually take the content and place it in that CSS. What it does is when you render it to the page, it'll send a request for that CSS, bring it back, and then make another request for the CSS, the other CSS file. Instead, in using import with your Sass, I can say import variables and have a variables Sass file here. Instead of making 2 requests here, it's only going to make 1, because it's actually going to take the content of variables and then place it right in this file. So it's only 1 request. So best design is you want to use import when using Sass. You want to take out, so you'll have a variables Sass, you'll have a functions Sass file, things like that. You want to make it modular. And then the extend. You can extend styles that were implemented for one HTML tag to another. So the footer here. So I have the footer, and then I have the styles that I want. But then I also want to extend the section, which is right here. So let's see what that looks like. So I have my footer here. And then if I go to section, I also see that there's a footer there. So I can apply the styles that was applied to section to my footer simply by saying extend section, right? And now I've taken those styles that were applied to section and applied it to my footer as well. Any questions so far on these? Right, so we also have mix-ins. What mix-in is, let's say I want to round the corners of anything that I want, right? Let's say buttons, forms, nav bar, anything I want. This is reusable code. I'm going to be applying this code to almost anything that I want to have round edges to, right? So instead of doing that to each style, I'll just add a mix-in. So you can see how it kind of behaves like a function. Because you can take in a parameter. So how much do I want to round the borders, right? And I can also specify a default value. So if I don't specify a value for it, it's going to use the 5 pixels. If I do specify a value, it's going to use that size to round all my borders, right? Okay, and so I'm applying it to my header, right? So I'm just going to say include round corners, and I'm going to apply 6 pixel. So let's take a look at what that looks like.
When you define the mix-in,
Yeah.
the order in which, where you define it, is that important? What if you define it after your call to import around the corner? Is it compiled, or is it
It does matter.
it doesn't?
Yeah. Typically, like I said, you want to have I'd have another file here that called mixin, and then I'd include it all the way at the top of my page. Yeah. So it does matter. But if we look here at the header, it has nothing. It has nothing to do with the mixin function that I called. It doesn't. It looks just as if I had written it, manually. And we also have functions. And so with functions, I can actually return values within the function, right? Why we actually write functions. So let's say I want to calculate the font of a certain HTML element. Instead of, so let's say I can have screen size here of 1024. I'm not actually doing it here, but okay, I have logo font size. So let's say I want to do font sizes depending on my logo font size. So I want to do logo font size divided by 8 and then times 2. And I'm not actually using the input value there, but where am I using it? Okay, so I'm using it in the footer, and I'm saying calculate font. So let's see what it looks like. It's just a number pixel, right? So as it compiles your Sass, it's going to go through the logic, get the number, and it's going to assign it to it. And then when you get your CSS file, it's just going to be that number.
So you said you passed in, well, you weren't using.
I wasn't using the input.
You passed in like 2% or 2 IN or some other, would it automatically?
Yeah.
Return that.
Yeah, and Sass is a little bit more robust with its calculations. I didn't really talk about calculations, but yeah, it'll know what if you're talking about pixels, EM, percentages. Less, not so much. It'll actually sometimes it'll output the wrong value, but with Sass, it's the operations are a lot more robust. So if you're doing a lot of operations, then Sass is more what you want. Another thing is with string interpolations is that I have a base URL here, right, and I've specified it right there as just a string. I can use these variables anywhere I want within strings as well. So just saying pound and then the curly brace and then my variable, I can input that string into my URL. So if we look at the body image URL, has images home, so you can do that as well. Alright. Import, extend, extends, functions. Alright, control directives. Like I said, you can do if, for, each, while. Alright, so the if logic, pretty simple. I'm wanting to style my btn process button, and I'm just having if this is true, so it's false, display block, else display none, right? So it's not going to display it. My for each, I can just say for header number from 3 to 4, and then I want to say dot h, and then I'm specifying, I'm doing a string interpolation right there. I'm putting in whatever number, so it's going to do h3 and h4, and it's going to specify font size, and then I'm including the mix in here. So I can do for loops as well. Let's take a look at what the if. See there, it's just saying display none, and then for the for loop, it outputted h3 and then H4 for me. And then the each, I can iterate through a string of arrays, an array of strings, and then each author and authors. We're going to do with the author ID, we're going to set the background to images, and then the author. So it's going to output first author, second author, third author, with each first, second, third author JPEG. Alright, we're out of time, so last one. So the while, we can do a while as well, and then so while the rows is greater than 0, I'm going to do row ID of rows, and then I'm going to set the font size, and then I'm going to decrement my row counter. So that's how I get row 5, row 4, row 3. So, like I said, you wanna use Sass or less, and then you wanna compile it on the server side, and then you just include your CSS styles in your HTML page. I know Justin, he wanted to use Sass, and the client was saying, you know, they don't want to use. They wanted to be able to handle. They don't know Sass, and so they wanted to be able to modify their own styles. And Justin was like, "That's fine. I'll just use Sass, and I'll compile it to CSS, and I'll give you the CSS." And so that's what he did. He just used Sass the whole time, compiled it to CSS, gave it to them. They had no idea that he was using Sass the whole time. So pretty powerful. All right, 1 minute over. Any questions? That was a lot.
Instead of spitting out one file, somehow have it spit out. Somehow just define I have 4 pages, and I'm going to spit out a separate CSS per page, because I only want those pages to be completely needed for that page. You know, if you do that.
You're talking about.
When it compiles a separate file, typically in different files.
I mean, you could have just separate Sass files, and then just they'll compile each to separate their own.
Okay.
Yeah. So like if I modify this, it creates its own CSS file. Right there. I'm not sure if were you saying like if like how I can like only have this content output to a certain CSS and then this content to a certain CSS? I'm not sure about that.
What are your requirements for handling Sass? I mean, you're looking at the files in web matrix there, but is that all you need? Like, is there some kind of
For Sass, you would.
Libraries you have to install or something?
Yeah, like if you're there's a whole bunch of different ways that you can install Sass, but you would first need Ruby. There's extensions that will do it all for you. Like I'm using the Orange Bits, and there's another one on Visual Studio called I forgot, but it'll install Ruby for you. It'll do everything that you need. But you can also do just install Sass Ruby yourself, and then go to the Git repository and grab Sass yourself, and then you can compile it through the command line if you want.
It's a Ruby. I think Justin has instructions, so it's like their Ruby's package manager. It's just Ruby gem install.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Yeah. And then I think you do like npm Sass or something like that, and you download Sass. I mean, there's different ways. I like just doing. I mean, there's extensions even in Visual Studio and Web Matrix that'll do it all for you. If you look at what the extension installs, you can go back through and it'll say it's installing Ruby, and then it installs all the components that you need for you. One thing, if you notice here, I think there's no IntelliSense, right? But there is, if I do it in the CSS file, that's just in Web Matrix. But if you download this extension in Visual Studio, it actually supports, yeah, it's called Mindscape Web Workbench, and it'll actually give you IntelliSense for you. So if I do, see how it gives me the list of my variables, so I can just do. So that's nice in Visual Studio. Orange Bits is for Web Matrix. If you're using Visual Studio, then you can do Mindscape Workbench, and that's free too.
I bet Web Essentials, I don't know, but I bet Web Essentials has some sort of support. Do you know? Which
I don't think it has support for Sass. It does have for out of the box Visual Studio. See how it Visual Studio it likes less, a lot more. That's because MVC 5 uses Bootstrap, and since Bootstrap was built with less, then you even get, so like if you add a new item, there's an option for less, but there is no option for Sass. And there's going to be one here because I installed the extension. But out of the box Visual Studio, it's not going to have your Sass. It's just going to have a less file.
Even 2012, when you jump to 2013, you can make it there.
No difference. Yeah, I tested it on my desktop. The same exact thing. Yeah, but you have less. You see how you have, this is the less file for Visual Studio that comes with Visual Studio, and then this is the less that comes with the Workbench. There's Sass, but there's no less with Visual Studio. So, but I think Web Essentials 2 has a pretty nice feature. Like we were looking at this mixin, right, and the border radius. What's nice about the Web Essentials 2013 is if you do border radius, it'll know that you need the WebKit and the Mozilla border, and it'll actually include that as you. So it's not going to do it here, but if I do size and then hit the semicolon, it's gonna import the WebKit and everything that you need for. That's pretty cool if you want to use Web Essentials on that. Because it's pretty hard. You never know. You have to keep up with what you have to include to support on different browsers and everything. But Web Essentials actually does that for you. It's a free install too. So. Yeah. Yeah, it's all publicly available. All these, unless you pay for the slides, and then you can make it private. But if the free version by default is public to everyone. and I'll upload it to my site once I put this video up as well. So yeah, and I added all the syntaxes for the Sass too. So you know, Sass website has great tutorials. So does Les. Oh, there's one more thing if you guys have time. There's also, if you don't, Justin likes using Foundation 5 rather than Bootstrap. And Foundation 5 is exact same things, exact same concept as Bootstrap, but what it does is built on Sass instead of less. They've been doing the mobile response, web response a lot earlier than Bootstrap. And
So you're saying forget everything that you're
no, I would personally use Bootstrap.
Okay.
Because some of the arguments for Foundation is that you don't have to unbootstrap Bootstrap, but I just showed you it doesn't look like Bootstrap, and I'm using Bootstrap right now, right? And another thing about Foundation that says that uses Sass. Well, I just use Sass with Bootstrap. I was just using Sass with Web Matrix right now. Yeah, those two are pretty much the big arguments for Foundation over Bootstrap. Again, Foundation doesn't have the community that Bootstrap has. So for Bootstrap, you're going to have a lot more documentation. You're going to have a lot more themes that you can choose from that people have already built that you can use for yourself. So a lot of people prefer Foundation. I would personally, I would stick to Bootstrap. But it's an option for you if you want it.
If I started with the MVC5 solution,
You already have Bootstrap. Bootstrap out of the box. Yeah, so.
Cool, thanks.
Cool. Yep, no problem.